Everyone, thank you for getting up this early to join us all. Yeah, as Mayam said, I am Gwen Breckelmans. I'm a researcher and I teach at the University College London. So I teach on different degrees looking at psychology and language sciences, so it's a bit of a combination of both. And a lot of my research is on how children in particular learn the sounds of a second language. So how they learn to speak it, but also how they learn to perceive the different sounds that they don't have themselves. And yeah, so I look at second language learning as well, and speech perception as well, and a bit of social linguistics, so looking at things with accents. So it's a bit all over the place, but it's a good spread, I suppose. So I don't know if there's questions that you have, because I know you read some of the things that I sent on, or if there's particular things you want to know, or...
I'm David,
Hello.
and I would like to ask if you were expecting your results in the experiment.
Mm-hmm. So that's the experiment where you read the summary for, right? Yeah. So I'll briefly summarize for everyone, just in case it's Monday morning, it's been a while. So basically what we looked at in that experiment is we had adults, 10-year-olds and 7-year-olds who were all in London, so they were English, and we had them learn Lithuanian words and with a sort of computerized game. And the main thing that we were looking at was how variations in what they were hearing in the game was influencing how they learned the words. So the particular thing that we were manipulating in this case was how many people were saying the words that they were learning, because there's quite a lot of literature in sort of adults who are learning a second language that has shown that if you hear a lot of different people, it's easier to learn new things, and then it's also easier to sort of extend that to new people. So for instance, if you're trying to learn a language and you only ever hear one person saying that language, you might start to think that the particular way that person says some things are the ways that the language works. But then if you hear someone with a different accent, suddenly it's very hard to try and generalize to someone new that you haven't heard before. So that's where the idea of if you hear more people, it becomes easier to sort of understand people from different accents and people who speak in a slightly different way. So that's why we were expecting having more variation to help for children as well. And that's why we were sort of looking into this particularly for word learning, because there it's been shown that having more variation is supposedly helpful in remembering the words for the children as well. But we found actually that in most cases it didn't actually help as much. It's a bit of a complicated bit. So partly yes, because for the adults that bit is very much in line with what previous research has found. So we figured that would be fairly consistent. So that part we weren't that surprised by. But the results that children don't seem to show that benefit of having more variation in was quite surprising. But at the same time, so that this was a project I did with some of my colleagues in the department, but I'm also working on something similar myself, where instead of looking at how people learn words, I'm looking at how people learn particular sounds in a computerized game over more time than we gave them here. And there I also haven't found much in terms of a benefit for the children when they were hearing multiple voices. In fact, what I found was that they did worse when they hear a lot of different voices because they find it too hard. So knowing that that was something I'd already found in a slightly different setting with kids in the same age, it wasn't necessarily something I was expecting to find again, but it was something that didn't surprise me as much when we did find it. So we didn't predict it to happen, but it wasn't shocking in finding it, if that makes sense.
Okay. Thank you.
That happens a lot in research, right? Yes.
Quite a lot of the time, it depends a bit on what you're looking at, but a lot of the time people try to do something that's partly new in the sort of field where no one's done what you done before what you're looking at, because that's the whole point of it being new and exciting, and you sort of predict what you're supposed to find based on what's already out there in the literature. But because there's things about it that mean you have new factors, it often means that you can't fully predict what comes out, and particularly in the type of research that I work on where small children are involved. So most of the research I do is on 7-year-olds or 10 or 11-year-olds. Children tend to do different things than adults. People are very bad at predicting what they'll do. So there's very surprising results that you find whenever you work with sort of younger children, even to the point where they just do completely different things on a computer game than you think they might do, which is also interesting.
Totally. Who wants to ask another question?
Me. So what's the ideal age for learning a second language?
Oh, the ideal age.
Yeah.
It's a good question. So there's a bit of a controversy in the literature. There's this idea called a critical period, where in second language learning, or in language learning in general, there's the idea that if you don't learn any language before, usually people say around puberty, it becomes very hard to learn language later in life. Of children who are deaf but who are born to parents who do hear, these parents don't necessarily speak sign language, or they can't sign to their child, so they're also learning as they go. So usually when the children go to school, that's the first time they properly get immersed in sign language and get language input. So that's how they found that in learning a first language, it's quite important to learn before about puberty. Afterwards, it gets really hard. And the research is a bit mixed. So there's some things out there that suggest that it's definitely easier if you learn before about 16, and after which it supposedly becomes harder, but it depends a bit on what part of the language you're looking at. So it's definitely not the case that you can no longer learn a language after you turn 16 and, well, might as well give up at that point. It's more that certain aspects of it become harder to learn. So usually the things that are harder when you start learning at a later age are the pronunciation, because you've been sort of immersed in another pronunciation for a long time, and there's you start tuning into a particular set of sounds, so it becomes really hard to hear the difference between sounds that you might not use yourself, and then saying those sounds is even harder. But there's also small bits in syntax, for instance, so in the structure of the sentence, or what things you need to mark on the sentence, that become harder to learn. There was this study not that long ago, I think 2 years maybe now, that looked at this in a really big sample. So they looked at it, they made a Facebook quiz, and they told people it was looking at what kind of accent they had, trying to figure out from, I don't know, 15 questions or so, where people were from and what their accent did, and both for accents of English, but also what other languages they spoke. I think they managed to look at like 600,000 people who filled that out, which is a lot of people. It went slightly viral on Facebook back when that was still a thing that happened. And they found that there's essentially two things going on that determine how easy it is to learn a second language. And one of them is the age at which you start, and the other one is the rate at which you learn. So if you are a really fast learner, then you could in theory start later, and then you have the same you need less time to learn the same amount of things. But what they found combining those two things is essentially that if you start after the age, I think, of 17, you don't have the learning rate isn't high enough to be able to fully reach a native-like level at an early time. So after that point, it never quite gets to the peak of language learning. Although in general, the idea of the research kind of shows that as long as you practice a lot, you can at least improve. and you can get to a really good level, even though it might not be fully native-like, whatever that is.
In the experiment, why did you choose Lithuanian to do in the experiment?
Why did we choose Lithuanian? Well, that's a very easy answer, actually. So one of the people on the project, so the I don't know if you could see in the summary, but the first author on that paper, so Ruta Sinkevičiūtė, she is Lithuanian herself, and she had people who could record the words, which helped quite a lot. So part of it was also to do with the fact that we're doing the research in London. London is quite multilingual, and it's hard to find people who only speak English in general. So you want to try, if you try and teach them another language they don't know, it needs to be a language that they actually don't know. And a lot of the schools that we went into are in areas where they speak a lot of Turkish, Greek, Bulgarian and Polish. So those languages were languages we couldn't use as a second language because they'd already know, or at least some of the children would already know the words that we were trying to teach them. So Lithuanian is, relatively speaking, not spoken as often in those areas of London where we managed to get a school. So that's why that worked quite well, essentially. So any child, we looked at the we sort of asked the children when we were doing the experiment what languages they spoke and what languages their parents spoke and that kind of thing, to get an idea of what languages they might have heard. And anyone who spoke Lithuanian was excluded from the actual analysis.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the other day we were doing some research and questions, and I have this question because it has been like, I have seen it all the time that why do adults don't like have the native accent, and for example little kids, they get the accent really quick? That's something that I cannot understand, like why?
That's a very good question, and it's part of the research I work on, actually, so that's really interesting. So the reason that that adults don't really get a fully native accent but little children do is partly to do with how, I wouldn't say how the brain works, but how language is sort of learnt when you're tiny. When you're just born, a child can essentially understand all the different sounds of all the different languages, because at that point the child doesn't know yet what language it's going to be spoken to. So it doesn't know what language it needs to be speaking, so it hasn't really decided that it doesn't need all these sounds that aren't in whatever language they speak. So they're sort of equipped for all possible languages that the world throws at them. And then depending on what languages they get exposed to, they start tuning in, is what they call that. And what that essentially means is they stop making distinctions between sounds that they don't seem to need. So the older a child gets, the more tuned in they get to the languages that they're learning or the languages that are around them. And that means that essentially by the time people are adults, they've really tuned into whatever language or languages their native languages are. And that also means that for some people it's quite hard to learn that some sounds actually sound different. They're not able to hear the difference in the first place. So if they can't hear the difference because they've not needed to use it for ages and ages, then being able to produce the difference themselves is quite hard, and usually takes a lot of time to first learn to be able to hear that there is a difference again before they can start to produce them.
Why do bilingual and trilingual people get confused with the language when they speak?
Why do they get confused, or whether they get confused?
Why?
Okay, why? So it depends a bit. So depends a bit on what stage of learning people are when they are a bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, what they do, and it depends a bit on how people look at it. So a lot of things that seem like people getting confused when they're learning more than one language is actually not people getting confused, it's people being really good at speaking more than one language and being able to mix them in consistent ways. So this is something called code switching or code mixing or translanguaging. And it essentially means that people are so good at speaking multiple languages that they can fluently mix them at points where it's grammatical to do so. And you can often see that if you have people who speak 2 or 3 languages and they're talking to someone else who speaks those same languages, or potentially not all of them, but at least some of them, you'll see that they're able to switch particular things out. So an example I often use for that is my previous housemate spoke Serbian, English and German. I still speak Dutch, English and German. Obviously I don't speak Serbian and she didn't speak Dutch, but if we couldn't think of the word in English, we would try and switch to German halfway through the sentence so that we would still know what was going on, to then switch back to English. You still sort of get communication where people completely understand what's going on. And the research that's looked at that has sort of shown that the points at which people switch are really fixed in a way. So people don't suddenly switch between, say, the article and the noun, because that's a weird point to switch in general. Like, those two belong together. So you wouldn't say the and then insert a noun of a different language. You tend to have both of those together, but you could switch before the whole block of the noun so that you use the article and the noun in whatever language you're switching to, or like different points in the sentence where you could switch, that type of thing. So usually what happens when people do get confused if they speak multiple languages is that there's a difference in how much input they get in the different languages. Usually you find that essentially if people have more input in one language than another, so if they speak one language more in school and everywhere else and only speak one language at home, or the other way around, where they speak one language with all of their family and their friends but then speak a different language in school, that the language in which they get more input is the one that's stronger, so that it's a bit there's things that they might not be able to get to as quickly in the language that they're speaking, that's their second or their third language. The other thing is that they might not have used that particular language in that context. So particularly if you're learning a second language or a third language, or it's your bilingual native language, but you only use it in school, that means that you might not have used that language to talk about things in the home, or you might only know particular things about a language in a school setting. So you might know how to talk about something like you might know how to write a school essay on a particular topic, but you wouldn't be able to use that language in a sort of informal setting with friends when talking about anything like films you've seen, because it's a very different way of using the language. So some of it is related to how much people actually use the language in that sense, and what they use the language for. The other point where they get confused is in those particular things related to whether there's sounds that they don't have in the other language they speak, and at what point they sort of start hearing the difference or not. And there's particular things in the structure of the sentence, so the syntax, that tend to transfer from one language to another, where they might use the structure from the other language in a different language that they're trying to speak. So a lot of it is to do with how quickly people can get access to whatever information it is that they're trying to get at, and that usually people don't have a fully 50-50 or 30-30-30 or however many languages they speak input on each of them. So one of them might always be slightly faster, so that's the one where they might transfer things from to the other languages, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that happens to all of us. It happens to me sometimes that I'm talking Spanish and then I'm using English syntax or even German things. I think it happens to you as well, right, guys?
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah,
same here.
David has many languages, right, David?
Ooh.
I know Spanish, English. I'm learning. Well, I should be learning Chinese, but I don't want to. French in school,
Mhm.
for languages, and everything I translated from Spanish. That is my main language.
Oh wow, that's a lot of languages. You know, I have the same issue myself when every now and then I have to write like a work email, but suddenly in Dutch to someone who also speaks Dutch. I've not had to do that ever. And then I need to have someone check my grammar because it doesn't work.
Yeah, it happens mostly to me when I'm talking, and I don't even realize it's other people that tell me what you just said is very wrong.
Yep, yep.
And I also think that we don't really know how the brain works. There are so many things we don't know, and
Yeah,
part
definitely.
of it is we don't really know how language works.
Yeah. So there's people doing all kinds of really interesting research into trying to find where in the brain language is and what it's doing. But they're currently still at the stage where they're trying to find out particular bits of language. So they've sort of roughly determined that there's bits of the brain that light up when you're hearing things, and that light up differently when you're hearing things that are language compared to things that are, I don't know, other sounds like birds or something that sounds like language but isn't actually sort of meaningful. So they know that that's a thing somewhere in the brain, and that's apparently a thing that the brain cares about. And the same goes for like things you see. So whether you're reading something, if it's something you can understand, your brain responds differently to it in lighting up. It activates different bits.
Okay, at what point of the learning of some language we start dreaming in that language?
Oh, that's a good question. At what point do you start dreaming in the other language? It depends a lot on how much you're using the language. So usually when you start dreaming in the other language is at the point at which you're no longer translating from the other language to whatever language you speak natively in your head. And then because then it's more of a subconscious process by that point. Like you don't have to think about, this is a sentence, I'm going to translate all of the words, I'm going to translate what everything means, and it's something that has become automated in that sense. And at that point it's something that apparently your brain thinks it can also do on autopilot when you're sleeping and when you're dreaming. But then there's still differences between people. Like there's people who never dream in a language in general, where they don't really think that there's language being used, and they just sort of have abstract concepts and they can't really tell you what language was being used. But there's also people who very specifically dream in a language. So it varies a bit between people, but usually it happens at the point at which you sort of don't have to think too much about speaking or understanding that language, where you could in theory switch.
Do any of you dream in English?
Yeah, I sometimes do.
No, never.
Yeah, I do.
Not yet.
Not
I
even
don't really
in
know
English.
if I dream in a language.
Yeah, I don't dream in a language. Mine is just weird abstract thing. I mean, most of the time I don't remember what I dream in the first place, so I can't really tell you, but
Well, I think we need to finish this meeting. It has been very, very nice to have you with us. Thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge.
anytime. It's very nice to see you all. And thank you for all the questions.